Okay, it is 11 o'clock. And has Jan joined us?
Yes, she
She
has
Okay.
joined us.
Yeah,
There you are. Okay, I needed to scroll down to see you, Jan. Good morning.
good morning.
Okay, so we're ready to begin our meeting, which we will do with the roll call.
Mr. Enns,
Here,
Miss Marks,
Here,
and Mr. Burbo.
Here,
We do have a quorum.
excellent. Then we will proceed to the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join me in saluting our nation's flag. I pledge allegiance
allegiance to the flag,
of the
United States of America,
to the
to the
republic,
republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation, under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
for all.
All right, thank you all. We will proceed then to see if we have any public comments listed as consent agenda, but I think first we'll do public comment regarding any items not on the agenda, but under the purview of the executive committee.
At this time, if a member of the public wishes to make a comment, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I have nobody for public comment.
All right, thank you. And then we will proceed. Next, we have the consent agenda, items 4 and 5, which are the draft minutes of February 25th and March 4th meetings. Let's see if we have any public comment regarding the consent agenda.
At this time, if a member of the public has a comment on consent, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. There's nobody for public comment.
Okay, does any member of the committee have any questions, concerns, corrections regarding the consent agenda items? If not, we'll take a motion.
motion to, I'll make a motion to approve the consent calendar.
I'll second it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Let's go ahead and call the roll.
Mr. Enns,
Yes,
Miss Marks,
Yes,
and Mr. Burbo.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
All right, thank you. So we will proceed on to the regular agenda. First will be item 6, and we'll allow public comment on each item after introduction by the staff. So,
So President Borbol, members of the board, on item number 6, the eScribe agenda management software. This is an item that, if approved by the executive committee, the purchasing policies of IWMA allow the purchase and the president to execute the agreement and staff to move forward without it going on the regular agenda of the IWMA board. The annual cost is less than $10,000 a year, and there's some startup costs. But the substance is that Sasha and Barbara did an evaluation of 3 different agenda platforms. As a result, the need that the existing agenda platform is less than proficient. eScribe, which is the proposed agenda platform that staff would like to transition to, was also then reviewed by our then Deputy Director, Patty Taves. And in addition, staff worked with the clerk of the board of the city of San Luis Obispo, who currently uses the eScribe agenda platform itself. When we move back to regular meetings and open meetings, it's anticipated and been board discussion about utilizing the city of San Luis Obispo's city council chambers for doing so. And if IWMA is using eScribe in the same agenda platform as the city of San Luis Obispo, then it will also make for the streaming of meetings more efficient. And the cost differential is negligible. All the platforms are around the same cost. And with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions, and Sasha's available as well for questions.
all right, any questions of staff on this subject? Okay. Yeah, it looks to me like the cost is almost identical.
Yeah.
And so it's to say we've had a little bit of disappointment with some of the features of the existing one, and so.
Yeah,
This is
and that,
just-
and to develop, have the same agenda platform as the city of San Luis Obispo, where we'd be streaming meetings from.
Okay, any If no questions, let's just see if we have any public comment regarding this agenda item.
Time if a member of the public wishes to make a comment, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I have nobody for public comment on item 6.
All right, seeing none, we will bring it back for a motion. Jan?
Yeah, I'd like to move approval and also just comment that since we will be meeting in the San Luis Obispo City Hall, once we're able to have in-person meetings, it's really important that our software is consistent with the city software, because the equipment in that room is set up to handle that software. So I think this is a really good idea, so it can be seamless. Thank you.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Okay, we have a motion from Jan Marks, second from Robert Enns. Let's go ahead and call the roll.
Ms. Marks,
Yes.
Mr. Enns.
Yes.
And Mr. Burbo.
Yes.
Motion
Okay, we'll
passes
move on.
unanimously.
All right, excellent. We will move on to item 7, discussion of IWMA in-person meeting, or how we're going to approach that. And we it's a good segue from what we just talked about. So, Pavo?
Thank you, President Board, members of the board. And Sasha, are you able to pop up the language that's in our staff report on the highlighted language?
Yes.
The idea is that at the last couple of board meetings, the question has prevailed about when must we go back to live meetings. In addition, just recently, the governor had rescinded a number of different executive orders. However, still leaving in place Executive Order N2520 and specifically paragraph 11, which allows for the continuation of, essentially what we're describing as Zoom meetings. And the basic provision in there that we believe your board can rely upon if you want to continue to have the Zoom meetings is the idea that if there is a state or local recommendation regarding social distancing and that there might be, a risk to health and safety. What Sasha's popped up is the CDP, and maybe you can scroll down a little bit, Sasha, so that we can specifically find that, yes, in fact, we have a state official with strong recommendations associated with social distancing, especially requirements for unvaccinated individuals. And in relying on this strong recommendation, again, it seems like the board can continue to have Zoom meetings. I've spoken to legal counsel. We will need at the next board meeting to work with the resolution a little bit and modify it considering the changes in that's occurred, with the governor and whatnot, and really get into this focus here. But we do have the strong recommendation. And the point I want to make is that even though you can resume in-person meetings, if that's the board's desire, I'm concerned because it would pretty much put staff in a position of having to check vaccination cards. It would put staff in a position of, having to ask individuals to make sure to wear masks. And what I noticed at 3 public events that I recently went to, that in every single situation where vaccination cards were being asked and where masks were being distributed, there was security guards in place. And we know that even though it's been rare, that there has been challenges and people who have disliked the mandates associated with masks or even vaccinations. And as long as we're in this state of emergency, and as long as a state or a local official has a strong recommendation, my advice to the board is to be very conscious about putting staff in a position that could be confrontational and includes these additional requirements, unless there's some compelling reason that you really think that we need to have in-person. So again, what we've done is we've gone through and we've researched the changes, the governor's termination of a certain executive orders, the fact that the executive order allowing for Zoom meetings still exists, strong recommendations on social distancing and masking in certain situations still exist. And so it appears to us for all these reasons that if the board so chooses, it can continue to hold Zoom meetings until there's some other change, and we'll continue to monitor.
But would we, in order to continue to hold Zoom type meetings, we need to continue to pass the monthly resolution, correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Correct.
And in passing it, we're stating that there is a good reason to do so, and the good reason being that there's still a recommendation about distancing, masking, especially unvaccinated people. So we have a basis to continue to pass the resolution, to continue to hold Zoom or hybrid meetings. Because I guess the question would be, to me, it makes sense in April just to do what we've been doing. But then we probably should have a discussion about going forward. Do we want to have have an in-person meeting, but allow members to Zoom, which would be based on the, if we wanted to do that, what would that be based on?
So, and Jeff, feel free to jump in and help clarify. I think I've got my arms around it pretty well, but even based on existing law, your board is allowed to have off-site locations. In those off-site locations, essentially you have to have the opportunity for public comment.
Which means you have to post the location. You have to say that
Correct.
Robert Owens and Jeff Heller will be at the Morro Bay City Hall if anybody would care to join them.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you have to identify which elected officials will be at which locations.
You do.
You do. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And so the concept, though, is that it could be accommodated, and I think there might be some advantages that the board would consider in addition to, the basic advantage of reducing travel time and everything. But, it's easy to envision that we could set up a site in North County, North Coast, South County, where elected officials from those three subregions could convene for the meeting. And even though there would be public comment required there, that's not a bad thing. In some ways it might help with additional public comment. But the one other benefit that I can see in addition to efficiencies is it might, we have a lot of special districts that are represented by IWMA, even though the special districts members themselves aren't sitting on the IWMA board, except for one. But by having these alternative locations, it is common for the special districts to have board members appointed to follow what IWMA is doing. And with additional offsite locations, it might encourage some of the non-voting members of the special districts to attend the meetings and provide input, and even have roundtable discussions afterwards that don't involve a formal quorum of the IWMA board. And so I think that there's some other potential benefits associated with having these locations as well.
I mean, currently, under the current guidance, you can have a board member participate remotely, even in a hybrid meeting. I mean, in other words, we had a city council meeting in person, but one of our members, was participating via Zoom. And in normal times, we would have to post that where they were, et cetera. But under this current circumstances, we didn't have to post that. And I'm wondering if we could continue to do that if we elected to have a base meeting in San Luis Obispo and had, others participate elsewhere, that as long as the state of emergency exists at the state level and there's a recommendation, that board members could participate from their own homes without post.
May I comment on that, Pavel?
Yeah,
Yes,
because we
Yeah,
didn't
so
cover
we're
that
going to be
topic.
able to do that. I think what we're seeing is a transition, right? transition between the norm that has existed for the last 2 years to trying to get back to where we were. And then I think there's a little bit of a stumbling because what we did and the stringent rules that applied 2 years ago seem to not apply as well today. So we're going to see a little bit of that, but we are going to get to the point where public should be able to participate remotely. I think it's everyone, I think universally thinks the more public input is better. So, and how to handle board members out of the office, out of the main meeting room, how we handle that. I think we'll be able to accommodate all those things. And I think what you're representing right now, what happened in the Atascadero, is exactly where we're going. So we don't know exactly, but we'll work it out.
Until they either rescind the emergency and we're back to the old rules, or the legislature adopts new Brown Act rules, which they're supposedly considering. So I see Robert has his hand raised, and I'd like to hear from him and Jan. So Robert, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll just add to some of the comments that were made. One, it's, I believe, easier, certainly for me, to do a Zoom meeting. I don't have to drive to San Luis. I don't have to drive back, Charles. You're out of Atascadero. But I think it's also easier for the public to attend. I think Janine Rance has shown us how that could work very nicely. And I was also thinking that it might be easier for handicapped people, whatever the handicap, to attend a Zoom meeting rather than a live meeting. We've seen recent spikes in the COVID cases, and I think that right now is not a good time to go back to public meetings. Further, I think that in the future, we're all going to be doing this. I think that in the future, there will not be general public assembly meetings. Finally, I think it's probably more cost effective to do a Zoom meeting. And if everyone can feel comfortable with the decisions we're making and how we're making them, then I think that's the way we need to go. I think I'd make it last as long as possible. And if you need to have a live place, just use the IWMA boardroom for your public and put some chairs in there and let them watch the screen. So those are my opinions. I'm all for continuing the Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you. Jan? You're muted, Jan.
After public comment, I would like to make a few comments myself.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and see if we have any public comment on this matter.
This time, if a member of the public wishes to make a comment, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I don't have anybody for public comment.
Okay. Go ahead, Jen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think under these circumstances, it's important to retain as much flexibility as we can build in under the law. Because frankly, we don't know what COVID is going to allow us or not allow us to do in the near future. I also wanted to just mention that in City Hall, San Luis Obispo City Hall, there's hybrid capacity in the hearing room. The hearing room is the little conference room that's off right next to the chambers. That's a much larger venue. But there's a capacity to do the hybrid meeting in the hearing room, but not in the council chambers at this point. Okay. So, but the hearing room can hold probably 10 or 12 people. So we could have our whole board there or some portion of it if we wished. And if these logistics are all worked out with our city clerk, but just to sort of keep that in mind. I do appreciate everything that Mr. Enns was saying, but I also want to add there is a value to just being together in person and communicating not only verbally, but in some way with body language, all kinds of nonverbal stuff that goes on during a meeting. And I think also in terms of attendance by the public, there is some value and that's can't really be quantified, but I say it's a qualitative value that, we also need to take that into consideration. But of course, the health concerns to me are primary. Second would be convenience. And then the third would be the value of just collegiality and, getting together as in person. So thank you.
I think, and so, I mean, this item is, for us to give staff direction, though, so for this April 13th regular board meeting, we'll just do, I'm not hearing any desire for us to do anything differently than what we've been doing, at least for the April 13th board meeting. And are we gonna, do we have it on the agenda for the full board to?
To
address?
readopt the resolution again? Yeah, it should be on.
Okay. And then, and if we wanted any discussion at that time, we could have it at that time as part of the regular board agenda. But I'm kind of, I agree with both what Robert said and what Jan said, in the sense that I think we've gotten used to doing this Zoom. I think for the farther away folks, directors, members of the board, they very much would like to continue to have the Zoom option. But at some point, that may be subject to some new rules, or it might be subject to if the state of emergency goes away. So I could see having at some point, we have a physical meeting place inside SLO City Hall. And again, I didn't realize you don't have hybrid capability in the chambers. And I think your chambers are so big that smaller side room probably makes more sense for a physical meeting place. But that hopefully we get to a point where we could have that, but board members who wanted to Zoom would still have the option to do that. But I think that's going to depend on where the state is with the state of emergency and with legislative changes to the Brown Act. But for now, we'll just keep going status quo unless any of our board members really want to push for having a physical meeting place. Does that make sense for the time being?
Yes.
Jan, is that all right? Is that okay with you? Does that make sense to you?
Jan is muted.
Well, I don't see that she's muted, but
Well, I'll unmute. Yes, I'd like to move the staff recommendation and direct staff to continue on with the April 13th meeting as we have in the past. And then when we meet during the April 13th meeting, perhaps we can discuss it again with the full board and see where the group would like to go with it.
yeah, and I think it'll be on the agenda as re-ratifying the AB 361 resolution, the monthly
Okay.
resolution. And that would be the opportunity point for us to have discussion with the full board on that.
Okay,
Thank you, Jan. I'll second your motion.
We did.
All
we
right.
offered public comment. Yeah, we already offered public comment, and this is kind of just direction, so we don't actually have to vote on that motion, right? Or do we?
No, we're
No.
good.
Just provide a direction.
As an item on the consent agenda, though,
It's normal.
yeah, it's normally on the consent, so that would not normally invite a board discussion on it. My thoughts is that, we're going to have some pretty in-depth board discussion, I think, on a couple of other agenda items. And maybe we again take it up with the executive committee next month to start talking about, how we might approach details
Okay.
once we're outside of the state of emergency.
Yeah, that would work for me, Pablo.
Sure,
And
that,
if-
that sounds fine too. I just want to make sure that if other board members have a perspective they'd like to share, that they have a chance.
And we can reach out to the other board members and start getting the general sense of the preference of the different board members as well.
Okay,
I think in Pablo's kind of conversations with board members, that would be a good thing for you to tell them what the executive committee talked about and see, let them know their input and desires are welcome, So, okay, well, with that, then we will move on to item number 8. Update on ratification process for the JPA amendment. And it says update on the process. We may or may not want to get down into the weeds, but whether we get into the weeds or not, it's important for us to talk about the process. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to turn it over to Pablo first or to Jeff?
Yeah, I was going to take the lead on this. Jeff, as legal counsel, really took the lead earlier based on the board direction and worked through the ad hoc committee, and then developed a process for making sure to get final input from all of the participating agencies, and then bring the document forward to the board as a whole, which happened in March. And then, as we know, it was approved, but not on a unanimous vote. And then subsequently, and what's been included in the addendum is some edits that we have received from one of the member cities. And so I want to first reflect on, what the board's direction was coming out of March, and that was to circulate the documents for ratification. And yet early in these efforts, it became apparent that it was more likely that the document would not be ratified as currently drafted. Now, we don't know that absolutely because it hasn't been, presented in front of any of the city councils yet. And in fact, in gaining an early understanding of the fact that the unlikelihood that it was going to be ratified by all the agencies, I really hesitated on distributing it to everybody in order to come back to the executive committee first and the board as a whole to discuss, the current status, which I just summarized, and also what new or revised direction might be appropriate considering the current status. And there was one particular conversation that I had that I want to reflect on more than any other, and that was a question that was posed to me, which was, well, what might we have done differently in the process? And I think that, the only real answer is that after the ad hoc committee meetings and after the board's most recent review in March, that rather than direction to ratify, the other option would be to circulate to the actual city councils for a final review and final feedback. And yet, in essence, that's kind of where we're at anyhow. So, the process itself has, I think, gone through a really good deliberative process of the ad hoc committee, coming back to the IWMA board as a whole, good opportunities for input. But in some ways, I just don't think it should be too surprising that we still have some additional work to do. The issues right now are very focused. It's always, there's a possibility that it could go back to one of the agencies, and some additional issues are put on the table. Legal counsel and I have actually talked a little bit about the status. We all know that the JPA amendments have to be approved by all of the cities in order to be in effect. What about the special districts? And so, Jeff, maybe you can now speak to a little bit about the idea that, well, although the cities all have to approve it, it's really going to come down to the individual special districts if they want to approve it or not.
Sure. Thank you, Pavo, President Barbeau, directors of the board. Really, the ultimate issue is, what does this JPA amendment look like? Where do we want to go? In order to amend the JPA, it's a current existing operative JPA, would require the consent of all the cities to amend it. Now, special districts, they were incorporated through a memorandum of agreement. Now they're going to be incorporated through the JPA. I think it was confusing. We all acknowledge it was confusing to go through having two documents. We don't need that. We can consolidate that. But if we are going to move as proposed by one agency member, to have one special district or not, if that's a discussion point. And also, I think the other discussion point is how, what are the efforts implemented by the IWMA to implement state mandates? How are those things reflected in the JPA? We can get through these issues, but I think we do at this point need board direction. But really, I think the primary issues are we having one CSDA representative or not? And the second issue being, does the JPA document itself want to restrict efforts of the agency in the implementation? So, Pablo, did I cover that okay?
Yeah, and then my follow-up, Jeff, is that we discussed that it would probably be appropriate to modify the language a little bit to make it clear that the revision to the JPA rescinds the MOA and then gives a period of time for the CSDs to then act as to whether they want to participate. And even after you and I had a discussion about, well, you know, give them at least 90 days. Some of the feedback I got was, well, we have a 6-month termination provision in the agreement. Why don't we give them 6 months? Because if any of the CSDs choose to go down a different path, then 6 months would give them, you know, at least some period of time to figure out what their transition is going to be and how they would otherwise act if they choose not to stay with IWMA.
So
I thought
and sorry, I don't want to jump on you there, but the follow-up is the current MOA says that changes to the MOA need to be done by resolution of the governing bodies. So I would be, no matter what we do, I'll be sending example resolutions to each agency saying, hey, if you're going to adopt it one way or the other, here's you know, whereas provisions, recital provisions, etc., to address in it. But I think really what we need to do right now is figure out where this board wants to go and where the pushing points are with the member agencies and the CSDs. So those are just procedural issues we can handle. Leave it over to the board at this point.
All right. First, we'll go with questions from board or committee members. Then we'll check on public comment, and then we'll do a comment discussion. So, Robert, you put your hand up first. Do you have questions for either
Well,
Pablo or Jeff?
There's some discussion about the special districts. And there was an effort to put another special district member on the board. And I want to point out that that effort didn't come from the special districts. It did not come from me, at least. And so I have no concern either way. Frankly, I prefer to have another special districts member. You put a lot of, or they put a lot of faith and believing that I can represent 10 different districts, undoubtedly a lot of different opinions. This gets back to, I have to do the best job I can and be able to explain it to any one of the 10 or 11 districts that call and ask. Someone pointed out there's about 50,000 people in the special districts population. I wasn't clear whether that included the county pulling out or not. And of course, the other thing is if we add another member to the board, we get an odd number board, and I think that helps. So I'm not, I don't really, it doesn't matter to me whether we have one or two or whatever. So if that's a sticking point somewhere, that'd be an easy one to give up. The thing, the other issue here that you brought up was the minimum effort to meet the state mandates. And I'm concerned that that could be quite a discussion about what the minimum actually was. Who's to decide? You know, and I think we went through a lot of effort to create our strategic plan. And in that, I think we described what our effort level was going to be. And we certainly added to that the word state mandates only. And maybe we're trying to discuss what exactly that means. But I would also point out that it's clear that the IWMA is not the quote enforcer here. And I think that if there's a mandate that you as a city or a special district really don't like, then you could just kind of turn your cheek on enforcement. I don't personally favor that approach, but that's certainly a way that it could be done. And I'd point out that we're not here to fight among ourselves. We're all interested in supporting the efficiency of the IWMA, that in consolidating the efforts that are needed to meet all these mandates. So I'm not seeing where some of these issues are real issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Jan?
Thank you. Yeah, I was not on the subcommittee, and but it's my understanding, I'd like to hear from Mr. Minery, that the Public Resources Code does specify that there would be one CSD member and all of the cities in a particular jurisdiction. Is that correct?
So the Public Resources Code contemplates one special district to be a member of a regional agency. And so the challenge that I was given out of the ad hoc committee was, how do we get 2 representatives on the board? And I was able to figure out a way to do that through a memorandum of agreement, things like this. So if we were going back, though, to one special district member, I would make them a member of the regional agency, slightly tweak the proposed structure that was presented to your board. Not significantly that would cause a need to for the ad hoc committee to reconvene, but I would put them back in as a member. So more,
Well,
I would adjust the structure slightly.
Yeah, I personally think that we were okay with one member. And like I said, I wasn't in the ad hoc committee, so I'm not aware of all the reasoning that was going on. But if that's a real sticking point, I think it's also a reason to just go back to the status quo. That's my opinion now that I know a little bit more about the Public Resources Code. In terms of the proposed language under the section, I think it's section 7, I'm not sure, but the limitations of our authority, self-limiting, where did that language come from? The language in the proposed document that we have before us today.
Came from Pismo Beach.
It came from Pismo Beach? Well,
Came from Pismo Beach's representative directly.
Oh, well,
within the last couple of weeks.
Oh, okay. So that was from one member. I think that should have been identified, because I didn't understand exactly where that came from. But here's my take on it. I think that I agree with Mr. Enns that we're talking about a policy, and it's in our strategic plan. We may need to create another policy, but I'm very concerned that the language as proposed would be sidestepping the authority and discretion of the executive director. And I also have talked with various staff members at IWMA, and the interpretation of what's minimum or what's mandatory or all that is pretty nuanced. Really, we need to follow the direction of Cal Recycle, and their direction is one that is continually interested in promoting the mission of the IWMA, the mission of Cal Recycle. And, so I'm concerned that the language that's proposed actually kind of undermines the mission. So I propose some other language. I certainly haven't spoken to my city, but I sent that to Mr. Minery, and I'll just read it here.
Have it?
Or can you share screen it? I don't know.
Sasha, can we first go to section 7?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Page 14 or 16, 14.
I think it's 7. Is it 7?
Yeah, it's section 7.
Oh, okay, alrighty.
Yeah, it's the very top of section 7. There
Yeah,
you go. right
okay,
there.
good.
Yeah.
So this proposed language that was put in there, it would have been helpful to me to know that that came from Pismo, because I was thinking, what is staff up to? I have no idea what's happening here. So what I've suggested that is that we would have, if we need to keep something in the JPA along this line, there would be something like this. When complying with state regulations and ordinances, work plans shall be implemented if deemed by the executive director as necessary for state compliance, acceptable to the community, and demonstratively cost effective. Exceptions to this minimum standard may be approved by a majority vote of the board. So what this language does is essentially supplant the discretion of the executive director with the discretion of the board. Well, okay, this would be a kind of let's micromanage staff on a level that none of us, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, would have the bandwidth to be able to sustain. And we've just been through what it means for our board to have to get into the nitty gritty of directing staff. And we are hunting for a new executive director or a permanent one. And we need to be able, as a board, be able to trust that person and trust their discretion. So anyway, that's my thought. So I'm hoping that when this language comes, that we don't just give this language to the board as a whole, as if this is something that the executive committee and staff think would be a good idea, this section 7. And so I know I'm going beyond the procedural aspect, but
No, I think you're on track.
I'm really concerned about this. It really bothers me, I have to say, frankly.
No, I think you're on track, Jen. I mean, it is a procedural thing to, we certainly want to make clear to the full board that, this isn't some random sentence that Jeff Minery or Pablo Ogren or one of us put in there.
Mhm.
This has been suggested specifically by a specific member city. I think the procedural concern here is that, because our JPA requires unanimity of members for changing the JPA, it really puts any given city in a, hey, I don't like that, we're going to vote no position. And, puts us in a little bit of a pickle from a procedural standpoint.
Well,
I'm gonna go-
yeah,
ahead.
I just want to say that to me, if this language could be couched as some proposed language, in other words, tease out the alternatives. There's that language that's up there on the share screen. There's this other language that I've suggested.
Mhm.
There's also leaving it out altogether. And then there's also if people have other thoughts, but to
I
me, we would get into real problems if Cal Recycle says you got to beef up your educational program, and someone on the board or a majority of the board says, oh, well, we don't want to spend the money doing that. But Cal Recycle is not mandating it, but they're saying, oh, listen, this is really good idea. This is the mission of what we're doing here. We need to try to combat climate change. And then we get into this deal where we're talking to the state and we're trying to micromanage staff. And it just seems to me like it would be totally counterproductive. So
No, I agree with Jen. I mean, for me, I read this kind of language as one could try to just say it's a statement of, principle or philosophy or something, but I just see it as it's impractical from the standpoint of an organization who has to deal in a highly regulatory environment and has a specific big daddy regulator, in this case,
Mhm.
Cal Recycle, because there's all kinds of scenarios where we as cities, special districts, whatever, have to deal with state mandates. And, it's very interpretive what it is, what's the minimum to meet the state mandate and what's going to be acceptable to that regulatory agency that oversees you. I mean, you couldn't say, well, we're just, if it comes to Regional Water Quality Control Board, we're only going to do the absolute bare minimum. Anything over that requires unanimous vote. As well as what you have here, especially this language regarding a unanimous vote is problematic because you had several entities who were very frustrated by, the 8-member requirement, and all of the cities put in the resolution, you got to do away with this 8-member requirement, blah, blah, blah. And then, here we have a proposal to put in a unanimous requirement.
Which is an 8-member requirement.
Which is 8 members at this point. But I mean, which the irony to me is I don't think supermajority requirements are necessarily an evil thing, especially if in a voluntary JPA where you might have to do, you might be voting on something controversial and you might say, well, the budget requires 2/3 approval, or the, ordinances require 2/3 approval or something. I don't inherently think that's an evil thing, but this language runs counter to the prior direction of the board. And I'm going into comments. I want to see if we have any public comment before we discuss it further. Because I have some more comments, but I want to see, Robert, can you wait till we see
Yes,
if we have
please, public comment.
Okay, yeah, let's see if we have any public comment on this.
At this time, if a member of the public wishes to make a comment, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I do have one for public comment. Okay, Deborah, give me 1 second. All right, you should be able to unmute yourself, Deborah.
I believe. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Deborah Logan. I'm the TCSD board president. That's the Templeton Community Service District. And with respect to this one item, I know it's no longer appearing on my screen, but I agree with some of the discussion. It appears that there needs to be, I think, some refinement of the language. The last sentence in particular that's being proposed seems to be a little heavy-handed, if you will, and getting into the operational details as opposed to really, I think, what the intent is. And I believe the intent of the language was to say, let's not do anything above and beyond what is absolutely necessary to ensure compliance. And I think we can all agree upon that. But getting into the day-to-day operations of how that's going to be achieved, I think is just too much detail. So I think the intent is a good one, but I think the language just needs to be refined a bit. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, any further public comment? I don't think there is. Then we'll bring it back. Robert, you have your hand raised.
Okay, Jan, I think the best comment that you made was leave it out altogether. Short of that, the wording that you proposed, I thought was adequate. As far as a message to Pismo, you have a chance, send your representative to the meeting. If you want to describe or get the board to make a tighter minimum, make your argument to the board and get your vote. And, let's get on to doing business here instead of trying to disrupt everything. I agree with the board president from Templeton, but I still lean toward just remove that entirely. Yeah. So that's where I am on that.
Thank you, Robert. Jan, you got your hand raised?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that would be a way to go, and just leave it out altogether. But the other option would be to just say, according to board policy, like we did elsewhere in the document. And Mr. Menery can probably remember better than I can exactly where in the document we did this. But if we wanted to put something that if we do an update to the strategic plan, which I think we may want to do when we have a permanent executive director, we can possibly get into that situation. But to include it in the JPA and then kind of hold the rest of us hostage is I don't think it's effective, and I also think it's creating a kind of a showdown scenario that we really don't need at this point. There's tremendous hope for an energy for a renewed IWMA that concentrates on the urban jurisdictions, and I'm really excited about the future. So I don't know. I just feel we don't need to pick a fight right now. At the same time, I think we also need to make sure that we don't do anything that's going to come back and bite us. So I'm not sure where to leave it in terms of what we do present to the board on April 13th. So could Pavo and could staff possibly help us think this through?
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
Thank
Jeff.
you. So where we left it with the last board meeting with the full board of the IWMA was the board, although it was not unanimous, did approve an amendment to the JPA, and it included 2 special district representatives in the language that was included therein, and it did grant certain leeway to adjust small non-substantive changes. Now we're talking about making changes that are substantive. We're talking about suggestions to minimizing special district representative to 1 representative. We're talking about changes to this section 7. So I would like direction as far as where you want me to go in coordination with your interim executive director. As far as I know, we have speculation that City of Paso may not approve the draft that was proposed and agreed to at the last IWMA meeting, but I don't know that for sure.
Paso.
So, did I say Paso?
You said Paso.
Sorry,
was saying
I meant
John
Pismo.
Hammond was totally
Sorry
on
about
board.
that. Sorry about that. To begin with. So-
Pismo. They both start with
Pismo.
the letter
I
P. I can
apologize.
understand.
E and end with O.
How do you want to approach this?
Well, let me make it, because I haven't made too much comments yet. I'm going to back up. One thing is, I mean, I thought also, as a way we could have avoided this. I mean, we had the ad hoc committee, you could only have so many members. And so in my mind is, okay, well, was Pismo in particular aware of where we were heading? And I recall that we had, we had updated the full board on the ad hoc committee's deliberations, and I'm pretty confident we specifically mentioned the 2 CSD reps, not just early on, like in January's meeting, but very, very specifically mentioned it at the last meeting and the logic and the why. And I believe in a meeting before that, as to why it was proposed that we have 2 CSD reps, for example. And then hopefully if that raised a level of concern on the part of a city, that we would have heard about that earlier. Because I frankly thought when it was first proposed that maybe we might get a city objection to it. I personally think we should have 2 CSD reps out of fairness because of the number of citizens they represent, especially if the county is going to put Los Osos back into play, that it would become part of the IWMA. You would now have 60,000 citizens in the CSDs, which is significantly more than our largest city, and way, way more than our smallest city. So I think of fairness, you should. But I don't believe that any city, I think Robert put it well, that it's not something to die, it's not a hill to die on, that I don't know that any city is going to go to the mat for a second CSD rep. So that's one that if that's what it takes to move the process forward, I think that's probably where we're headed. And then, Jeff would go back to, hey, there's just one member CSD as opposed to having 2 votes on the board, et cetera. But I think this other one is a bigger concern. And I think it's a bad idea. I mean, just for me, it's not good governance for the reasons that Robert and Jan both articulated. But I think, Jan, you also pointed out very well that essentially you have 4 alternatives. You can go with this kind of language. You could go with the kind of alternative language you suggested. You could go with deleting it entirely, or you could go with some other language that, you know, somebody or a group of somebodies comes up with. Procedurally, though, and I think where Pablo and Jeff are left looking for our guidance and or what will the full board say is, okay, how hard up on this language is Pismo in the sense that they proposed this, their representative proposed this, but it's fairly clear from, I think, the conversations Pablo's had to try to, you know, get to the bottom of this, that, you know, he is speaking for the full Pismo City Council. This is, you know, not, because, you know, any one of us can be a little out of touch with our city council in the sense of, you know, language on something or where we're headed. But I think he has the backing of the Pismo City Council in this regard. And it goes back to requiring unanimous approval for changes. But that doesn't, so that means one city can say no, but that doesn't mean one city can tell all the other cities that this has got to be the language. And so I think procedurally, we've got to have a full discussion of this in the board. In the meantime, it means as a practical matter, there's no point in putting it forward to the jurisdictions, which was our last guidance. You know, we passed it 6-1. We said, okay, Jeff, you can make non-substantive changes. You can send it to the jurisdictions for ratification. But Pablo pointed out that it should go to Pismo first since they voted no. Right now, as it is, unless Pismo votes to conditionally approve it with their language, essentially they're a no vote. And so something's
Oh.
got to give here, but I don't think we can
Mhm.
surmise what that is without a full board discussion.
Well, yeah, if I could just say, I'm not sure that in fact would be the case. It's possible that, I mean, we don't know about the reasoning or can't really forecast what the Pismo City Council would do, you know. It seems to me that if staff could point out in the staff report that section 7, that there's been a suggestion from one city that this language that's up on the board be inserted into section 7. Then there's been another suggestion that other language be inserted there. And then the third alternative is to just leave it out altogether and direct staff to you know, come back with updates to the strategic plan, you know, at the next regularly scheduled update, whenever that would be. So, you know, I think just presenting the document the way it is now looks like the executive board and staff want that language in there as a staff recommendation. Okay, so that I'd like to see this taken out and then, you know, just present it without that language there and then present it as an issue to be discussed by the full board. What do they want to do in terms of what is circulated to the cities?
I agree, Janet. It definitely shouldn't come forward with just this copy with blue language. It needs to be very clear that this is, you know, you have a proposal from a city for revised language, you have an alternative proposal, and you have certainly some sentiment here that this language shouldn't be there at all. I might suggest another alternative maybe for staff to think of, and that is this is kind of a philosophical statement that maybe somewhere in the whereases or something, because we have it in our strategic plan, as Robert noted, that our focus is on things mandated by the state. And that's kind of more, that's a statement of philosophy that, hey, we're gonna focus on doing those things that are required by the state, but it doesn't try to dictate something we're gonna do, or it doesn't try to dictate what the executive director does or doesn't do. So maybe there's a way of incorporating some sort of statement of intent, if you will, or into either into the whereases or somewhere else on it. So anyway, they think about that. Robert, you have your hand raised.
Okay, Jan, I agree with you. Take it out. Show the board this language, show them the revised language that you proposed. Suggest that the third alternative is to leave it out entirely. And I'll let Pismo bring their rep and make their case. And if they can convince the rest of the board to do something like this, well, maybe we need to do that. But a unanimous vote requirement is, I don't know, that's a little
No,
strange in my experience.
yeah, that puts us right back into
And
something
let's
you
talk
called a
about-
snake bite at one point, Robert, and I got a little ticked off at you.
Sorry.
But this puts us back into snake bite territory as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
Well,
good.
let's
The
let's
other-
talk about that.
The other thing is, I think in our strategic plan, if I remember, there is some language about being cost effective and being efficient about how we go about implementing these mandates. So I think it's there. I don't really think we need this language at all.
You know, that would be good. I don't recall exactly when the Pismo representative came onto the board, but perhaps he was not there when we considered the strategic plan. That was, I believe, before he came on the board. That would be also something great to have in the staff report to say, this is the language in the strategic plan that puts it, that, you know, is at the operational level.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be part of the JPA. I don't think it belongs in the JPA. Okay, I'm repeating myself, sorry.
I think Pablo has some input, and I want to prop what we're talking about, though. Ultimately, we have a procedural question of thinking ahead is, okay, we're going to have this discussion at our April 13th meeting. You know, if one city says, hey, you know, our city really wants this, we're voting no, then we have an open question of, okay, beyond that, I mean, that essentially means our current JPA language is our JPA with all that means and entails. And which I'll let maybe Jeff address that, but Pablo wanted to speak, I think.
Yes, I obviously, it's always smart for staff to say, I like the discussion that the executive committee is having, and I like the idea of, you know, providing some optional language to the board at the regular meeting, because I let it obviously off with the discussion about process, and, you know, Jeff has discussed about the need for guidance, but it's unavoidable to also talk about the language. And when I look at this language, you know, and as the executive committee members have stated, that the unanimous vote language is real questionable. Because what I did is I went back and I reviewed the actions of each of the agencies at the end of 2021. And the direction from each of the agencies was to get rid of the supermajority vote. So when I look at this language, that requirement for unanimous vote, and I'm not expressing an opinion on whether I think it's a good idea. I'm just doing it as a comparison to the actions that the city councils took already. And so a unanimous vote is inconsistent with the vote of the city councils at the end of 2021. My next thought goes to the thought that our TCSD president expressed, which is that there's good intent behind this language. And so, you know, I'm hoping that that is recognized, because when we move and we see something like unanimous vote, and then we say, oh, automatically it needs to be edited because of the inconsistency, then what other kind of edits might we want to make? And that's essentially where your executive committee has landed, which is, well, what are our other options? One option is to not do it at all, you know, have none of this language in it. Director Marks, committee member Marks, has given up some proposed language. And so the question is, do you want staff to develop some possible language edits as well, and, you know, potentially circulate it amongst the city managers to get some feedback? And where my mind goes on that is the new language that we have in here regarding Prop 218. So one of our other member agencies, specifically the city of Arroyo Grande, had proposed language regarding Prop 218. That established a new standard in the JPA, just as this proposed language in Section 7 is established. We don't need to move to that language, though, Sasha. But the point is that as a JPA, how we address the language that was this new standard proposed by a task by Arroyo Grande was the development of the fee setting policy. And when I look at this language, I go to the question of how does this affect our budget policies? Because the challenge, and even though I think, with all due respect on the committee members and pointing to the strategic plan, is the strategic plan is still a lesser document than the JPA. And the strategic plan could always be changed. And so clearly the city of Pismo Beach is looking for something that is more substantive in the JPA itself that is going to affect, subsequent board decisions. And to me, the budget is still the #1 tool that elected officials have. How much money are you going to budget for different activities? And so I could see the analogy where, again, Prop 218 language and this new standard on 218 that was incorporated into the JPA on the suggestion and desire of Arroyo Grande and others resulted in a fee setting policy. And so my mind goes to how might we take the good intent behind this language and point to a requirement for a budget policy, and not just any, willy-nilly budget policy, but a budget policy that's really focused on cost effectiveness, implementations of the mandates. The concern that I have on minimum measures is how is that actually defined? I ultimately believe that that's why, one of the many reasons why elected officials are important. That is, the decision really of your legislative body. But by having in a JPA some guidance that says, the IWMA shall establish a budget policy that addresses these following factors, I think we might be able to utilize the good intent and develop something good here. But to me, and I have provided this feedback to many, it's one thing is minimum measures, and another issue is equitable services throughout the region. And so we might find ourselves that the minimum necessary, and minimum is also going to result in discussions and judgment with Cal Recycle, but the minimum necessary may not provide equitable services throughout the region. And we all know that legislative bodies and those of you who are elected to office often have to weigh different factors, factors like cost effectiveness, factors like program effectiveness, and are they being equitably, provided throughout the region? And so I think that trying to, make some edits and point back to a budget policy that reflects the intent of really being cost effective is maybe another option for the board as a whole to consider. And again, drawing the analogy of the Prop 218 issue and how we address that through the fee setting policy. And so whether I'm open to, developing some language and, circulating it to the city managers and getting some, feedback from them, would that be within the realm of executive committee direction to staff?
So you're thinking in terms of, like I was saying, you could possibly put some language either somewhere else or some other language in this paragraph. You suggest maybe you try to come up with something and that there's enough time for you to run it by city managers prior to the April 13th meeting?
Well, they wouldn't have a lot of time.
No,
to
they wouldn't have a
review
lot
it,
of time, but
if they wanted to, then they could, but at least, put another option for the IWMA board as a whole to consider. Because right now, we've got a couple of language options, and I think about, how do we take the intent here and craft something that's good? And
before I go to you two, I want to articulate, though, to be clear about like what Paul was talking about, because it's a great example. And that is, if you take this kind of language, say we're going to do the minimum. Let's say, so the minimum is we have a household hazardous waste site somewhere in our jurisdiction, perhaps, in the center of the county in Slough or something. But that's the minimum. But then you have a situation where you're not providing household hazardous waste services to the North County and the South County and the coast, et cetera, because, hey, we're just doing the minimum. And yet you now have a complete inequity of services provided across the jurisdictions. And that, to me, that's a good concrete example of how this kind of language could really drive poor governance as well as, poor service to our member and participating agencies. Okay, so Robert, I think you had your hand first and then Jan.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't intend to. put it
Oh,
up.
okay.
Okay.
I think we're doing just fine.
Okay, Jan?
Yeah, I think Pablo's suggestion makes a lot of sense. If there could be staff, that, in the staff report to suggest other language in that spot, but also what Charles Barbeau was saying, possibly as part of the whereases, if it could be. I'm not ego involved at all with the language that I proposed. I just really want to make sure that the discretion of the executive director is maintained, partly because otherwise it's upward delegation. I don't want to I don't want the board to be in a position where we're trying to figure out whether an extra hazardous waste station in Arroyo Grande or Pismo is the minimum. I mean, it's angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's just, it's operational, and it needs to be clearly stated as such. So staff does need clear direction, though, and so I'm just going to throw this out and see if we can actually come up with something that will be reasonable. One would be that staff would follow Pavo's suggestion of meeting with the city managers and crafting some alternate language. And then also somewhere in the staff report, including the Pismo proposed language, and teasing out other alternatives, including leaving it out and leaving out the language in section 7 and instead including it in an update to the strategic plan. And then also in the staff report to go back to the strategic plan and quote the language that has already been approved, which this Pismo representative may not have been aware of. So is that enough clarity? And somebody else help me organize it better.
No, I think those are good things for staff, guidance for staff going forward until the April 13th meeting when we have a full board discussion on it. In terms of trying to, put ourselves in the shoes of Pismo Beach, and yes, their representative came on after the 2020 election. In fact, not even right away in 2021. So it's not participant in the strategic plan. But as Pablo noted, the strategic plan is a lesser, document. It does not carry the force of an ordinance, or certainly not of the JPA. I think what, Pismo is looking for here is some sort of, okay, we said we would focus on mandates. We want to see some language that, really put some force behind that. And I just think that the language provided is not good language. And I think, so yeah, we let Pablo see if we can come up with some alternatives in that when it comes to the meeting on April 13th to present that, hey, this is some language suggested by Pismo. Here's some alternative language suggested as a possible thing. The alternative is to not have any language, or some alternative is to put some language somewhere else in the JPA. And then, try to do as much coordination, although I suspect that some city managers are going to say, why is this a big deal? But, having Pablo do that outreach would be helpful, because we still have the inevitable issue of what happens, and this is more of a Jeff Minery question, what happens if one city says, whatever language we ultimately agree with as a board, or at least have some consensus on, one city can still say, hey, we don't like it. And Jeff, if that happens, ultimately, you don't have a JPA amendment, you have your existing JPA language, which I think in the long term is problematic. And essentially, we'd have to come together again to somehow arrive at acceptable language, I guess.
So You're right. That's true. We have to come to consensus between the city members first. Yeah, I was thinking about it as I was listening to your committee's discussion on this item. You know, it's amazing that actually we've gone through the amount of amendments we've gone through with this. Went through the board once, the full board last meeting, and we're down to this discussion, which ultimately shows a very significant narrowing of issues. I don't have any real concerns that all the cities will be able to get together with this. So small hurdle at the end. I think Pavo made the comment that you know, it's anticipated there would be these types of issues. So yes, we do need consensus of all the cities. I think you'll get there. We're really just dialing it in.
All right, well, I think we've beat this horse to death, haven't we? Do we need any more further comment, or are we, Pablo, you've got what you need as far as,
Yes, we're good to go.
okay. All right, then let's move on. We already had public comment, public input, so let's move on to item number 9, which is our draft agenda for the full board meeting.
And just real quick, right off the bat, we know that we need to add to the end of this agenda a closed session item regarding the executive director recruitment. And the final filing date on applicants is going to be, I believe it's April 11th, Jeff?
I believe so.
So it may just be you're in closed session to, you know, see how many applicants you have and a list of whom they might be. And your Avery may not have had yet a chance to do much evaluation of them. But, you know, there's a lot of different topics that your board could, you know, talk to about timing, or maybe there is some initial screening of applicants. But, you know, whatever the topics of discussion would be in the closed session, we just simply need to add that to the end of the agenda. So we will plan on doing so. With respect to the items in the consent agenda, if you can move forward, Sasha. Yeah, so we've already, you know, essentially already talked about item number 7, and we have executive committee direction on that. Number 8 is the annual agreement with the auditor controller to essentially, I call it, act as the paying agent, you know, to process our bills. That agreement is currently being worked on. Barbara is taking the lead on it, and we may not have that on the agenda then. For April 13th. Our due date is, you know, the current agreement expires June 30th. So Barbara's kind of ahead of the curve on the timing on this one. But I did see some correspondence this week from Jim Hamilton, the county auditor controller, and I've had some discussions with him. So the timing of it might not make April 13th, but it'll be close. If not April, then May, and certainly before June 30th. The employee handbook one is the one where I have put for executive committee review in advance forward with a bunch of edits that I've proposed. I met with staff as required by the employee handbook, and we reviewed my edits this week. And I have a few other edits too that I'm proposing. But before jumping into those and recognizing the time and everything, I sort of want to talk about my overall thoughts. And my overall thoughts are that I've quickly put together edits on items that I think are important. So, or are clear edits that need to be made to the employee handbook that I won't say that they're not substantive, but they're not changes to the existing policy. So for example, throughout the document, throughout the employee handbook, I noted different descriptions of employee evaluations. And sometimes they were in, you know, if there's position cutbacks, and sometimes, Sasha, let's hold off on that real quickly. I don't want to get into the review of the document yet. And so there was inconsistencies in the document about employee evaluations. And so I made edits in order to make those to make those consistent. There is in the employee benefits section, there is certain language that just didn't make sense. And so I cleaned that up. But overall, what I really see is sort of a 3-step approach to updating the employee handbook. This first step is really some basic changes that point to the need to look at it even further, but they're basic changes. The second question really is that there's some specific cross-references between IWMA's employee handbook and county code. And so there's references to county codes on things like how much sick leave are you paid off when at end of employment, or to what extent do probationary employees get to take vacation time or not? And I found in the recitals that these cross-references to the county personnel policies were to help reduce how big the IWMA employee handbook has to be. But when I actually looked at the details, I'm not convinced. And it seems to me that some of those cross-references to the county's code actually makes more confusion, that our employee handbook should just simply say, what is the employee payout for sick leave at the end of employment? But I did not delve into those kind of details and what types of recommendations should be forthcoming. The area that I think is area where I did propose edits is this language that says that IWMA shall mirror county job classifications and shall mirror county compensation. And that's also in a redundant manner included in policy F10. And even though your board recently adopted that policy, I have heartache with it because in the language that says mirroring, and also that we will coordinate with the county on changes, the reality is the county's not going to inform us when they're changing their county code. They're not going to inform us when they change details in the MOUs with their employee bargaining units. And our ability to track, the nuances of county policy and how they might affect our individual positions is just, I don't see it as being productive. Instead, what I think is productive is we point to in the employee handbook that the IWMA board shall consider things like cost of living adjustments as part of their annual budget review. So what I'm kind of describing is this multiple step process to really modify the employee handbook. I've taken the first thing, which are cleaning up inconsistencies, and I'm proposing to delete the language about mirroring because I just think that opens up IWMA to employee grievances. All it takes is one employee to find one job spec at the county that better matches their duties in order to say that, look, I'm working out of class and I might be entitled to some additional compensation. The general references to the county's job spec and the general references to the county's compensation to use as benchmarking, I think is a great idea. And so that's why I changed the language from mirror to act in general guidance. So the question to me, from me, really to the executive director, the executive committee, is do I really want to put these for approval on the regular agenda, or receive and file and start with this multi-step process? Because my concern is that the regular board meeting as a whole, there's going to be good discussions on the JPA, and we really need to start talking about budget policies and moving forward with the goals for next year, as well as RFPs. And even though I've taken initial steps on this employee handbook, I think there's more. And what I want to avoid is really distracting the board from the primary things we need to focus on, JPA, budget, and RFPs, and get into a long discussion on the employee handbook that might take us sideways. Since I think these are pretty straightforward amendments, the way that I've structured this right now is to put it on the regular board's consent agenda for approval. In the staff report, I can make mention of additional work that needs to be done. Or we can put it on the consent agenda for a review and file. That's basically, this is the first set of edits. If board members want to call staff up or call me up and say, hey, you know, what about this edit? Why are you doing this? But hold off on making any formal approval until the additional work has been done with reference to decoupling from county policy or county code and doing the additional. So decoupling from county code. And then the third one is with regard to employee benefits that are incorporated into the existing handbook. I think those all have to really be part of labor discussions as part of the budget, and confirmed with legal counsel today that those discussions would be appropriate in closed session as part of sort of unrepresented bargaining units and part of consideration of cost of living adjustments and other things that could be done concurrently with budget review. So, you know, that's a big old brain dump, I guess, in a way.
I guess I'm confused in terms of time sensitivity, what you're asking us to do at the April board meeting. Are you essentially asking whether you should include both these these wording changes in the policy and the repeal of this policy as a consent calendar item? Or
so that's one option. And then the second option is simply to put those as you know, a review item, and then lay out that there's additional steps that are necessary to address the employee handbook. And what essentially we're doing is then distributing this first set of edits to all board members, and those who wish to, you know, look at them in greater detail could give us a call and talk through them. I'm just concerned that if I ask for actual approval at the regular board meeting, it could prompt a lot of discussions and then distract us from, you know, the bigger issues that we need to work on, which is the JPA and the budget and the RFPs.
Well, let's see, we have both hands raised. I'm not sure, Jan, I think you were first on the hand raise.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm under the, it's my understanding that Pavo has the authority to make those edits right now. And I would like to ask Mr. Minery if that's his understanding as well. And if so, I think the edits could be made as an interim measure and then, you know, do it as a receive and file, and with a staff report that says, you know, after we have hired our permanent executive director, there will be another update after that person has had a chance to review the employee handbook. But I would be reluctant to put this off forever, because I think all of those changes are quite sensible and need to be made, you know, right now, before anything would happen that would cause problems. So.
Thank you, Jan. Robert?
I think there was a question there.
Yeah, the
Jan,
question
from Jeff.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
And
Sure,
hey, Jeff,
thank you, President
Jeff,
Barbaro, Director Marks. Yeah, I do believe your interim executive director has the ability to make these changes. I think then what you're suggesting is that this would be on the agenda as a receive and file. And I think that what's happening is that you're seeing a revision of policies at the executive director's discretion, but also keeping the board informed of those changes. And I will say I've seen nothing but problems from this concept, which is an overlying concept of we just simply track the county. That is not the case. And the problem is that the governing codes, that the statutory authority for the county is different than for a special district. So it creates problems. So I think what's happening is that Pavo is starting to look into these things and starting to dissect these differences. So I do believe the changes that he's making are consistent with good governance. So I think keeping the board aware of these changes is smart, but he doesn't need board approval for those small changes. If that helps.
and if I might follow up a little bit, because Section 1.5 does provide provides the executive director to make subsequent amendments from time to time to conform with current law, which of course really makes sense because then I just turn to legal counsel and say, hey, what do we need to make in order? But it also says in best practices. And so I think that, the idea that I have some current authority on best practices is true. I don't know that that would apply necessarily to every single edit that I'm proposing. So I'll go through those with legal counsel to make sure that we are staying within that term of best practices. Sasha, let's not run through the document.
I did want to point out while it's on the screen, though, that the very next sentence, though, does say that any other amendments in this document shall be made only through approval of the board.
And so one of the exercises that I'll go through with legal counsel then is that certainly are provisions within the document that state that it requires board approval. So for example, salaries and compensation require board approval. And we'll go back through and look at the document itself and make sure that the edits that are finalized and then we put as receive and file are truly within that discretion of best practices and don't conflict with any of the provisions that are currently retained by the board as a whole, including salaries and compensation and whatnot. And then in the staff report, I'll describe, the subsequent efforts that are necessary to address some of the other policy issues that are not being addressed at this first pass. And I kind of like that too, because then it will provide some direction to the permanent executive director, rather than being given a football that says just run with it. There's blocking involved, there's a direction, he knows what the game plan is, and he or she will be able to pick it up and run with it more effectively that way. So.
Okay, Robert, you had your hand raised.
Just wanted to say, perfect, you got it. Put it on receive and file and explain the additional efforts you're going to make, and I support that.
Okay, I had a comment on this, and that is, I think it's important that it be as a receive and file because confidence in Pablo. In fact, I thank Pablo for looking into this kind of thing, seeing the need to make some of these kind of updates and changes, but that the board should always be aware of changes in policy. And so receive and file is appropriate. I wouldn't want you to just make changes and, never know about it. Because it's incumbent upon us as board members, not everyone's going to do it, but to look at these kinds of things. And that gives us the opportunity to ask questions if we have them, but it doesn't tie down the agenda or the board with we have to approve it sort of thing. It's under receive and file. I've made these changes to this policy. I think the more substantive thing is actually revoking this F10 policy that, as you noted, we recently amended. But it goes to the point that Jeff was making that our thing of, we're going to follow the county on this and we're going to default to the county on this. That came about in, I'll call it our immediate post-scandal period in 2018 when it came to light, there may have been some problems, we lost and people resigned, et cetera. Mike Giancola is the interim director, and the board had a sense that this agency didn't have enough clear policy on some things. And so it became a matter of, well, let's follow the county model. Let's follow the county as guidance. And what we're seeing is over time that in some of those cases, that wasn't the smartest thing to do. And I think that's where we're kind of at on that. It was understandable why we did it, but I think we're looking at it, and as Jeff is stating and Pablo's stating, we need to move on. We need to move beyond that, and that's.
Yeah, so I appreciate that follow-up because that rescinding policy F10 would then be, the consent agenda would have two actions, right? One is recommend rescinding policy F10 and receive and filing the updated employee handbook.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay, so
that's item number 9 on the consent agenda, and then for the regular board meeting. And then the two regular business items are the RFPs and the, starting the budget preview discussion. With regard to the RFPs, Barbara has put together a list of basically all the contracts that we have. And so we're going to have that organized in order to really make sure that we focus on what contracts is the board really directing us to do RFPs on. And then because we have certain expiration dates, for example, on electronic waste, we have an existing contract that goes through 2023. So we're going to focus on which contracts we believe the board wants us to update on RFPs and which ones don't. It's a little bit of a confirmation process, but then the timing too of the different RFPs. So for example, under SB 1383, we have requirements for outreach to businesses and some route reviews and monitoring, and talking with Kelly, that we really need to be moving on sooner because it's part of SB 1383 and we have certain deadlines that are approaching us. Second priority is RFPs associated with educational programs. And even though that's been a bit more of a focus of board discussion, we don't really anticipate doing that RFP first. We anticipate doing that second. It might be that, you know, whoever's doing education in schools next year won't be able to get started until fall. But it's also the educational RFP that we think we need to have more discussions, both with the LTF, getting feedback from the board. So I'm going to, the intent of the 13th meeting is to review the different contracts that we have, what the deadlines are, where we think we're going first and second, and then just getting some general board input on, you know, whether it's education or whether it's a business outreach and that type of thing. So starting it one step at a time. And then with respect to the budget, there's really four.
Yes. Before you go to the budget item, you know, may recall that I think it was in September that we did have somewhat, we did provide some kind of preliminary board guidance, I think, that for staff to look at these, all of these professional services contracts that we have and to come back over time about, you know, potentially putting them out to RFP. And so essentially it's really a follow-on to our that guidance from September. So
okay, and good point, because I'll make sure to review that and also reflect in the staff report what was previously directed and now how we're moving forward with that direction. That might also give me the ability to reduce, you know, some of the contracts that we might otherwise put on the list.
So go ahead, budget.
And then the budget preview is one is identifying the, you know, the four different hearings that the board is going to be, or four different business items that the board is going to be considering leading up to the preliminary budget and then ultimately the final budget after the new year starts. And trying to focus first and foremost on what kind of budget policy should we be thinking about and what kind of goals for next year. Because right now, other than the adoption of the reserve policy, we don't really have any budget policies. I think that talking about budget policies will also be good because there's a relationship to the JPA discussion that we just had and limitation of authority. I think that for the most part, you know, the HF&H fee analysis and all the numbers in there are the big support for the proposed budget next year. There's other work that needs to be done, like addressing cost of living adjustments and some of those salary issues. But a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done. And we'll have to, you know, look at some of those details again. During the fee discussion, we knew that, you know, what we were talking about, some of the other SB 1383 costs. But in any case, as far as the numbers go, that would be preliminary review would be in May. And again, I think a lot of that direction has already been set or numbers crunched through the HF&H fee analysis. So.
Okay. Before I forget, I'm going to go out and see if, because this, you know, the board agenda, meeting agenda is item number 9 on our executive committee meeting agenda. I do want to see if we have any public input on this agenda item, which is a discussion of the full board meeting agenda for April 13th.
At this time, if a member of the public wishes to make a comment, you may press your raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I have no one for public comment.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a sort of a question for either Jeff and or Pavo. As you're building the budget, you mentioned the rate increase. We passed the rate increase. And Jeff, I know last time when we passed the preliminary rate increase, you sent out a letter to the jurisdictions notifying them of that effect. And of course, you offered, you addressed that whether they have a 218 issue or not is up to them. City of Slow, sent out their rate increase letters, at least according to the newspaper, 17% or something like that. And surprisingly to me, at least in newspaper articles, they never mentioned the IWMA fee increase, at least not specifically. But are we, right now, we're scheduled to begin collecting that revenue July 1st, correct?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Isn't that right, Pavo?
And so we sent out the proper notice to the haulers whom we are collecting the revenue from?
Have not yet sent out the notice. We have the industry meeting on Tuesday.
Okay.
And so I'll be discussing with them. Kelly's put together draft slides associated with some of the program issues, and I need to ask her to put one together also to confirm the fee setting. And I want to have a little bit of discussion with them as to whether or not they have follow-up questions for us as they are working with the individual jurisdictions.
But the jurisdictions are, I don't know if they've been formally notified at all that we adopted, through board action, we adopted the 5.7% number.
5.4%.
5.4%. Thank you.
Correct.
No,
I just made it worse.
I think everybody's sort of generally aware, but we do need to do formal notifications.
Yeah, because if they need that for any reason, as far as their own rate setting processes, we have, we as a board, full board, formally adopted the 5.4%. Okay, all right, Jan, Robert, do you guys have any further questions on the April 13th agenda?
Just a comment, Charles. I think there's 2 number 9s in here, and I think Sasha tried to explain that to me. So I
Yes,
think
and we
that's
have
already
made
been
that
changed.
correction. In one of the revised package, we have that correction. So our status right now is for, in the most recent version as on the web, is we are adding to business items and basically the update on JPA language and looking for additional board direction. And then adding to closed session at the end of the meeting for the executive director recruitment. And then item number 8 on the consent agenda calendar may or may not be included depending on when we get the agreement from the county auditor. And then with respect to the employee handbook, doing a receive and file for the edits that I'm authorized to approve, and I concur and gain concurrence with legal counsel. So
Perfect.
those are the summary of notes that I have on the changes to the regular agenda that we've discussed.
So do we need a motion to approve the full board agenda as amended,
Yes.
as you described? Okay, all right, Jan, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a general comment that has to do with the RFPs that we were talking about. And wanted people to know that I did visit Science Discovery, the premises with Kelly York yesterday. And I was really impressed with the facility and the programs and what they're doing and how they've weathered the COVID. And they mentioned, Mr. DeMilo mentioned that he would be happy to give any board members a tour anytime. And so I just wanted to say that when we're looking at the RFP, I think it's really important that we consider what services we have at present. And then that will help inform us when we put together the the RFPs. And also the question of whether we want to divide it into commercial, residential, or, commercial versus educational, or commercial and residential versus educational, if we want to divide it and like that. So it's just kind of a heads up. I do think that it's important that we know that the board has a sense of what the status quo is before we put out the RFPs.
Good point. Thank you, Jen. I might try to schedule a trip myself, a tour.
I'll comment that I've had the opportunity to go out there, and I agree with Jan that it's worth the effort.
Yeah. And the other thing, when we're talking about future agenda items, I'm wondering if we would want to have a quarterly agenda item that would be program updates. And I've discussed this idea. Kelly told me this is her idea. I've discussed it with her, just so that the board and the public in general are more aware of what programs we have and updates about what's going on out there in the field. So that's just something to throw out for future agenda items. That I don't know, what do people think about that?
I think, Jan, in the past, I think we used to get some of that in the executive director's oral report. Back, maybe we drifted away from that, but there was a time when Patty, while Brooks was here, or while Mike Giancola was here, would give an operational update periodically as part of the director's oral report as to what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And my thoughts were anticipating that when we're in the next regular board meeting and discussing next year and some goals, that would be one of the topics of discussion, because
Okay.
I think that a monthly update as part of the executive director report on some of the basic day-to-day stuff is good. But I also think that there needs to be a periodic review of overall program, an overall program review of, and not just how is the contractor doing, but how is IWMA doing in its program implementation. Budgets, we know, tend to follow pretty good timing. They're quarterly or semi-annual mid-year review. Sometimes program reviews don't necessarily follow quarterly updates. Sometimes there's milestones and programs that are best to tailor after it. But I do think that, having a goal regarding program reviews on a timely and periodic basis will, really help address some of the issues that, especially with consulting contracts, that just wasn't occurring previously.
I think the key thing here is I think really what Jan's getting at is that the board is sometimes unaware of what our, how our programs are functioning. And so even if I look at maybe the oral report as the opportunity to perhaps do that, but that maybe every month, every other month, you pick a different program that the IWMA runs and say, this month I'd like to give you an update on, battery or, battery and paint take backs at the stores. And, this is, so you understand, this is how many places we do it. This is kind of volume we're getting, whatever. Just so that we as board members don't fall out of touch with what it is the IWMA is doing and how, how busy it is, what it's accomplishing, et cetera. And that we, because not everybody's going to get out and take an actual field trip of, let's say, science discovery, but some of our programs, you can't take a field trip. Unless you go, take something back to Home Depot and watch what they do with it.
Well, I think it's a chance to spotlight some of the good work that we're doing, and also at times to give individual staff members a chance for a few minutes to address the board and the public together. And, just not an action item at all, but just kind of like a study session or an update or something like that. So I think that would really really be cool. And whatever staff, however staff would like to handle that,
Okay.
it would be fine.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jan. So do we have a motion for approval of the April 13th agenda as amended?
I'll make that motion as amended.
Okay, I'll second it as amended.
Okay, all right. So we have, let's have a roll call, please.
Mr. Enns,
Yes.
Ms. Marks,
Yes,
and Mr. Burbo.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously as amended.
All right. I believe that concludes our meeting, and we will see everybody at our full board meeting on April 13th.
Good meeting, Charles. Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks. Let's kill ourselves over here.